All right. Hello, everybody. I think we're about ready to get started now. A little bit of feedback. All right. Hello, everyone. Namaste and good afternoon to everyone here to our webinar session today that is titled Nonviolent Resistance Movements and Climate Justice in South Asia. I'm saying good afternoon here because it's about 3 p.m. in Kathmandu, but I know that we're joined by many different attendees here from various time zones. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and very, very happy that everybody here could join us. I'm seeing many familiar names and familiar faces here in our Zoom window as attendees are filtering in. For those of you who don't know me, I am Shubham Rizal, and I am the research lead here at Center for Social Change, today's organizing institution. Some of you have also worked with me under various different capacities, whether it's through my work with climate change communication or through various writing projects for different publications, or through my work as a research consultant. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us today, and I'm happy everybody made it here. As we have attendees still filtering in, I'd like to quickly remind everyone that we are recording this event today. And the final recorded version of this conversation is going to end up on our website, on the CSC website, as well as on YouTube and various other social platforms in the form of the entire webinar, as well as small clips. We are also live streaming currently on Facebook Live, where we have a subset of our audience of about 5,000 viewers watching us. So if you're watching us on Facebook Live currently, hello, thank you for joining us. If you haven't, please do make sure to like and follow the Center for Social Change page for regular updates, for the latest publications and other events such as this one we're doing today. Today's webinar is the 9th event of Center for Social Change's ongoing webinar series. It is the third of the series that we are focusing on nonviolent civil resistance as a topic particularly. And today's event introduces the topics of environment, climate change, climate justice, and sustainable development to our ongoing conversation. This is a topic that's very close to my heart. So I'm very excited that we're able to bring this dimension of climate change and climate justice into our ongoing work with nonviolent civil resistance. So before we get started, I'd like to quickly say a few words of introduction about our organizing institution today. So Center for Social Change, or CSC, is a nonprofit making social think tank based in Kathmandu, Nepal. And we work, in various capacities with the kind of overarching aim of changing the socio-political dynamics of Nepali society, as well as, largely the South Asian societies. We do this via various different approaches, including research, education, evidence-based policy advocacy, community mobilization. CSC was established in 2015, and in the short time that it's been active, it's really kind of emerged as a front runner in all these different areas in Nepali society. Currently, CSC is involved in a number of different various ongoing projects with different timelines. And the kind of key areas of focus that the organization is working on right now are conflict transformation, peace building, democracy and governance, migration, labor, civic space, and of course, our topics for the day, climate change and nonviolent civil resistance. So to learn more about CSC, please visit our website at socialchange.org.np. That's socialchange.org.np. You can also follow us on social media. We are available on all the platforms. Just search our name and we'll pop up. That's Center with a CENTRE, Center for Social Change. Okay, so with that out of the way, I'm very happy and I'm very excited to be hosting and moderating this webinar today. The general area of climate change and climate justice is one that I mentioned earlier is very close to me. It has been all my life, and I've been working on this pretty much my entire adult life today. So I'm happy to spotlight a few South Asian issues that are pertinent within this space. each of our panelists today is also involved in both the spaces of climate change / climate justice, as well as nonviolent civil resistance through some way or another, whether it is, directly participating through kind of resistance movements themselves, or whether it's from a distance, studying these phenomenon, environmental policy, environmental security, from a more research perspective. And this is a very important topic because, it's really, in the last few years, we've seen this really take center stage in the kind of South Asian political and socio-political discourse. And it really seems like that's the way things are going. And that's primarily because, as we all know, South Asia is deeply, deeply vulnerable to the climate crisis. Despite all the different health outcomes and all the different economic shocks of COVID-19 and all the socio-political issues that are happening in all the individual pockets and communities across South Asia, it is really quite surprising that environmental issues have been so widely discussed and so prominent in the news and in general discourse in the past few years. In this year alone, we're in October now, so we're a third of the way in. And in my country of Nepal alone, we've seen record wildfires. We've seen really dangerous air pollution that shut down the country for a couple of days. We've seen floods, landslides in hilly areas. The glaciers are melting in the Himalaya. Various policy concerns have also come to light, from everyday things such as the popularization of electric vehicles, all the way to very serious issues such as the legalization of harmful practices like sand mining. So this topic is really, really coming to center in this region. And as unbelievable as it seems, given the COVID context, the truth is, if we trace back to what experts have been saying and what experts have been warning us about for decades, it's really not that surprising. Even zooming out of Nepal, the South Asian situation is even more scary. South Asia is blessed with very rich and diverse geography, which is unfortunately also manifesting as a curse for the climate change effects it's facing. There are many unique geographical makeups within this region that open the doors to dangerous disasters such as floods, wildfires, landslides, glacial outbursts. We have all sorts of, ecosystems within this region as well, from the high Himalaya all the way down to the Great Indian Desert in Northwest India. And unfortunately, what happens is, in all this, sometimes the human side of climate change kind of tends to get neglected. Many of us forget that, these technical conversations about carbon emissions and, carbon capture and all this stuff, that there are actually real human lives involved. There are real individual human stories involved in all these disasters. And natural disasters aren't really the only way that these problems manifest themselves anyway. Heat has several effects that affect things at a social level as well. So, with that in mind, the term climate justice has become popularized recently in the last few decades. And for those of us unfamiliar with the term, essentially climate justice is just a way to frame the climate change as a crisis, as not just a physical or not just a natural or environmental phenomenon, but also a social phenomenon. And really an ethical phenomenon when you consider the historical carbon emission rates around the world. The truth is, a lot of the really developed and industrialized countries today became developed and industrialized through all sorts of carbon emissions and environmental malpractices. But unfortunately, they are not on the front lines of the effects of climate change. Countries in South Asia are. So with that being said, there is a ground for and a natural urgent need for people-led resistance against the systems that are causing this crisis in the first place. Interestingly, the way that climate justice civil movements have worked is that they're not always against political systems. Political parties, political leaders are definitely a part of the puzzle, but people have also been campaigning very hard against corporations, against even multilateral organizations, or as we call them, super governments, like say the United Nations. So with all that in mind, a few kind of really prominent South Asian movements also do come to mind. The farmers' movements that we saw, all the farmers' protests we saw over the last year and a half across South Asia. Those have been really, really prominent in the news. They've captured a lot of international attention. But besides that, there's all sorts of little pockets of issues everywhere as well. The Punjabi farmer unions have caught a lot of the news. Recently, the Bhumi Sena, which organizes the indigenous people in the state of Maharashtra, has also been catching a lot of fire in the recent few weeks. Little organizations in Sri Lanka, organizations in the Maldives, all these different countries have different problems, but they're all rooted in the climate crisis, and they're all fighting to offset climate justice concerns. I'm happy to say that we actually have two panelists today who are themselves in key leadership positions of globally organized and locally chaptered climate justice movements as well. I'm talking about Hoshala, who leads the Fashion Revolution in Nepal, and Iqbal, who leads Fridays for Future in Pakistan, among many other things that both these are up to. So we're going to talk about each of the individual panelists in details right before I introduce them. But I think for now we can get started with Dr. Dhanasree Jairam. So before I introduce Dr. Jairam, I'd like to quickly remind all the panelists that we do have an allotted maximum of 15 minutes. And once that time is up, I will be chiming in to remind you. And I'd also like to remind all the attendees here to please keep your mics muted during the presentations, but you can feel free to have the video on if you'd like. So our first panelist today is Dr. Dhanasree Jairam, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Geopolitics and International Relations at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education in Karnataka, India. She also serves as the coordinator of the Center for Climate Studies at Manipal. Dr. Jairam is a research fellow at Earth Systems Governance and is a member of the Climate Security Expert Network. She holds a PhD in geopolitics and international relations from Manipal itself, and has spent time outside the country doing various research fellowships in countries including the Netherlands, Switzerland, and others. She's also the author of two exciting publications. One is one came out in 2012, I believe, called Breaking Out of the Greenhouse. And another one is very, very recent, called Climate Diplomacy and Emerging Economies. I have had the personal pleasure of knowing Dr. Jairam for a few months now, and I've always come away with really interesting and really insightful learnings every time I interact with her. So I'm not going to take any more of your time, and I'm going to let Dr. Jairam have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Shivam. And thank you, Center for Social Change, for giving me this opportunity to speak about a very important subject. Because I think it's very important to look at citizens' movements today, especially at a time when you have COVID-19 as one of the biggest threats that the humankind faces. And then we had the IPCC report coming in August, which has basically given us the signal that, okay, we are in code red situation where we need to act. And yet what we see around the world among the governments is sluggishness in terms of climate action. So in such a situation, what is more important is to have more and more ground level movement, which can hopefully at some point of time upscaled into action at the highest levels of governance as well. And in that respect, it is very important to look at citizens' movements and also non-violent measures by which climate action can be accelerated across the spectrum. So I'm just going to share my screen. Work. Yeah. I hope it's visible. Yeah, okay. I hope it's visible. So what I'm going to talk about is climate change action in South Asia, and to briefly look at some of the problems, first of all, and then look at some of the movements that have worked in the past and some of the movements that could possibly work in the future as well. And in that respect, I'll be looking at different mechanisms that have been introduced by countries within South Asia as well. So just to start with this report, which I authored along with some of the researchers from Adelphi, which is a think tank based in Berlin, in Germany. And this is called Climate Fragility Risk Brief in South Asia. And what essentially, as part of the study, what we came across was that, of course, as Shubham mentioned, South Asia is one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world, and there is no doubt about it. And that there are various reasons for saying that, and that is because of the annual mean temperature rise, the number of drought and heat waves related incidents, the intensity and frequency of extreme weather events like cyclones, which have, of course, increased in recent times, increasing flooding threats, glacial melt. And in that sense, there are various sectors across the spectrum which are affected by climate change, including agriculture, fisheries, water, human health, ecosystems, infrastructure, and industry. So, in short, climate change is possibly the biggest human security threat that South Asian countries today face. And in all sectors, as you can see, livelihood options, for instance, get eroded. Developmental gains get eroded as we move ahead and as the climate change crisis worsens. Water quality has reduced as well, which obviously also affects the agricultural sector in a big way. There is, of course, the damage is caused by cyclones and other kinds of extreme weather events like floods, which is also causing a lot of problems in the urban centers and peri-urban centers as well. So these are some of the broader climate impacts and the security threats or human security implications of climate change in this region. I'm just going to show you a few, so-called hotspots when it comes to climate change. And already these parts of the region are facing the brunt of climate change. So to say that climate change is something futuristic and we are going to be affected by 10 years down the line or 20 years down the line, I think those days are gone. We are being affected by it now. And there are many people who are on the front lines, basically. Sundarbans is one such area. It's an area that is shared by India and Bangladesh. And why I'm using these transnational examples is also to show the requirement for countries to come together and people across political boundaries to come together to deal with this issue. Sundarbans is one of the hotspots, and in both India and Bangladesh, there are many cases of migrants who have moved from the coastal areas to interior places and cities, and basically trying to make a living in a new place. And these are the places which are affected by cyclones, sea level rise, tides, and all other different sorts of impacts of climate change, and saltwater intrusion, which is also one of the major impacts of climate change in this region. So this is one area. Then the other area, which is also a transnational sort of picture, which shows a transnational picture of climate change, is the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. And there are so many countries that are part of it, as the map shows here. And of course, if you look at the number of people who are going to be affected by climate change in this region, it's huge. And it's not just people living in the region, it is also the people who are dependent on the waters from the rivers that flow down from the Tibetan plateau who are going to be affected by it. So you have 1.9 billion people, for instance, who depend on the Hindu Kush Himalaya region for water, food, and energy. And as you can see, this is also a region which has high levels of poverty. And this is where climate justice, for instance, becomes very important part of the debate. Because as we talk about climate action, it is also important to emancipate people from these poverty levels, which have also reduced their resilience to climate change to a large extent. And at the same time, you also have movements against these dams that are being constructed all across the Hindu Kush Himalaya region. And I wanted to show this primarily because you have to look at the number of dams which are being proposed by the governments in this region. And I have taken only China and India as an example here, but there are such dams being proposed all across this region. And there are non-violent protests against most of these dams. And recently, when even in India, the talks about dam construction in Uttarakhand was floated, there were a huge amount of protests by the local population and environmental activists against these dams, primarily because recently also we have seen how much of destruction these dams can cause, especially when you have GLOF incidents or landslides or any such incidents as well. Some of these images again show you the picture of climate justice in South Asia. The first picture essentially shows you the divide in Mumbai, the city of Mumbai, which is the economic capital or the commercial capital of India. You can see the Dharavi slums on one side and the and the high-rise buildings on the other side, and that is the kind of divide that we are seeing. So there are some people who are going to be affected by climate change even more than the others. The other picture shows you the slums in Dhaka, and then you have, sorry, how much time do I have?
Keep going, Dr. Chara.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, I thought there was, just trying to tell me how much time do I have left. Sorry. Yeah, and then this picture also shows you how floods, for instance, this is a vegetable vendor. This image became viral. It became the image which showed how floods in Mumbai are affecting people very differently. And this is a vegetable vendor who was deeply affected by the COVID pandemic, and how he lost his business during the lockdowns, and then this floods happened and completely destroyed his business. So this is how climate justice again takes shape in some of these contexts. This particular article, I'm just taking the, just wearing the academic hat for like just a couple of minutes to show you. Yet, with all these pictures and all these discourses, you still have discourses of climate delay, and where you have a lot of discourses which basically obstruct or delay climate action. That includes doomism to whataboutism to appealing to policy perfectionism, and also technocratic solutions, which Shubham mentioned. There's a lot of talk about technocratic solutions as well, which can sort of arouse some amount of optimism as well. So in all this talk about climate action, you still have a lot of discourses of climate delay, which also in a way affects people on the ground as well. It's not just about people who are in the government level, but also those at the those who are living on the ground, who get affected by these discourses of climate delay. Another important aspect in South Asia is to look at conflict sensitivity as well, because when we look at climate action, we tend to forget that the same climate action could have effects on the conflict sensitivities as well, as communities try to adapt to climate change. So in that sense, there is that importance of broader framework for adaptation, enabling civil society and decision makers in fragile states to design and implement adaptation strategies, institutional support, or working together with stakeholders from both inside and outside the government. All these things become highly important in conflict sensitive situations. I'm talking about conflict sensitivities, especially because in South Asia, most of the countries are either having cross-border conflicts, or there are countries which have come out of civil wars, and therefore there is a sensitivity towards conflict as well. So in such situation, climate change essentially assumes much higher importance, and therefore the actions will have to then take into consideration the citizens' movements and enabling the civil society to participate in these actions in a much broader way. And in that sense, there are a lot of ways in which, in today's context in South Asia, there is a lot of movement towards nature-based solutions to climate change. And in this respect, I would say there are more and more positive examples coming out from various parts of the countries all across this region, where people want to invest in the ecosystems, forests, grasslands, mangroves, wetlands, and there is financial support being offered by international financial institutions as well as national level financial institutions as well, where there is that possibility of involving the citizens in a much deeper way, and at the same time get the benefits of empowerment of people, as well as greenhouse gas emissions reduction. In fact, this is where payment of ecosystem services becomes very important. And just last year, in fact, or earlier this year, I'm not recalling the exact year, but Uttarakhand, for instance, decided that they would now start calculating the gross environmental product and not just the domestic product, right? So in that sense, where you need to pay to the communities, pay to the citizens who are involved in conserving resources or protecting resources, that becomes a very important part of empowering people who are engaged in these activities. And this is something that is gaining a lot of momentum as well in many parts of this region. Another mechanism which I feel is involving the local communities a lot more is forecast-based financing. This is something the UN, the Red Cross, the World Food Program is one such program which has also introduced this to see how you can empower, or you can transfer cash, for instance, to people much before the disaster hit. So before the floods hit all these districts in Nepal, money was transferred to the people who would be affected by it, and that has reduced basically the suffering of the people to a large extent, and also this has reduced the cost of the disaster itself. So in these activities also, the vulnerability assessment, risk assessment, all these activities are being done with the help of citizens movements and non-governmental organizations and other stakeholders who may be engaged in this. So this is something that is gaining a lot of momentum. Just to give a brief background of what has happened in the past, and I think some of these movements have given that sort of impetus to the new age climate change movements as well. So this is the picture of Vandana Shiva, who revolutionized the idea of Bija Satyagraha. So this is something very important for the agricultural sector, which is the biggest sufferer as far as climate effects are concerned. And this particular movement essentially talks about the farmer seed sovereignty, right? This is very important because we are talking also about empowering farmers to carry out their tasks without affecting the environment, and at the same time them being able to survive the effects of climate change as well. Because now we are talking about a situation where groundwater extraction has become a huge problem across the agricultural belts of this region as well. So these are some of the movements which have taken shape in the agricultural sector. This is another way to look at energy sector, for instance, where the International Solar Alliance, for instance, has taken the lead in terms of training women to take up solar energy as a way of as a livelihood option, as well as something by which they can shift from using firewood or something else, like which is more polluting, which also affects their health, to something like solar energy, through which they can also improve their health conditions and their family's health conditions. So this is another movement which is run by, again, a group called Barefoot College, which does a lot of activity. And just to finally talk about this particular climate action network. In fact, this is present in many regions, including Southeast Asia, South Asia. And they, like this one in South Asia, the coalition of over 250 civil society organizations. And in a way, this is also something that puts pressure on the government and individuals to limit human-induced climate change to a large extent. So I will stop there, and I'm more than happy to take questions later on. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jairam. That was, as always, very interesting and very insightful. I do see that we have a few questions coming in the chat, so I'd like to encourage everyone to just interact. If you have any thoughts or comments or questions, please feel free to put them in. Our team is going through them, and then we'll go over them at the end, after all the presentations are done. Dr. Jairam, those photographs you showed were really quite moving, especially because we're at the sort of end or beginning, depending on how you look at it, of the monsoon cycle right now. And Kathmandu just, I think, 10 days ago, just saw these record-breaking flash floods because of the heavy rainfall. And as it happens every year, these are natural problems, but they really highlight urban planning issues, drainage issues, and everything else that a lot of South Asian cities have in common, unfortunately. I also found that diagram of delayed discourses really interesting, so I'll probably bug you about that later to get a copy of that, because I think I want to take a closer look at it. Okay, so Dr. Jairam, we'll come to you at the end. But for now, let me waste no time to introduce the next speaker, Haushala Thapa. Haushala is many, many different things by profession and by passion. She is an educator. She runs a residential school targeting the holistic development of marginalized children in Godavari, which is a very close by suburb of Kathmandu city. She is also the co-founder and creative head of Haushala Creatives, a women's cooperative that supports skill development among women and youth from marginalized communities. And she's a big advocate for sustainable fashion through Hoshala Creatives. She's also the country coordinator for Fashion Revolution Nepal. She's been a very prominent activist in the Nepali climate space for many years. She's lent her voice to many different causes over the years, including several very recent movements, quite high profile movements, as one of the founding members of the People's Alliance for Nature Nepal, or PAN Nepal, which is a voluntary initiative here in Nepal aiming to protect environment and biodiversity. Hoshala, I'm especially going to thank you today for joining us all the way from California against the time zones. We really appreciate you making time for us today. And please go ahead and take the floor.
Thank you so much, Shubhan, and thank you for the entire team for inviting me to speak here. And thank you, Dr. Jayaram. It was just, it's a stark reminder of where we are right now. So I'm going to be sharing my screen, and please give me a thumbs up if you can see that.
Yep, we can see your screen.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Sorry. So as Shivam introduced you, my name is Hausha Brun Zapa. I'm an educator by profession and also a creativity amplifier. My presentation here will entail more on activism and roots in activism, of how activism has played a huge role in the movement that we've done with several, like Shivam said, several high profile movements, but also things about climate justice, and which is attached with a lot of other things that we have been talking about with the climate crisis. So I'm going to give you a glimpse of the movement. And in order to present, I have divided the topics for the audience to understand more about what a movement means and how activism has flowed together, and how we have been moving forward, and how these movements have taken a turn, and why it matters. So we've divided into 5 terms: of knowing our audience, accessibility to information, fact-based information, public participation, hope, and community. Like Dr. Jayaram had just shared about fact-based information and how that is super, super important for activism. Moving forward, it has been very, very, as an activist and as a pool of other people, educators, activists, researchers, it has been very, very important to understand our audience. It has been very important to understand our audience because in most of the time in climate change movements or in the information that we see, it is always only circulated around people that already know the jargons, people that already know the issues. But what we have to see deeper is that people who do not know those jargons, but communities who do not understand or have not had the privilege or the accessibility of those jargons is also very important. Having accessibility to those information is the first key, most important part of a movement. So processing information that is out there, finding verified facts and information is important in any movement, but also realizing our own privileges of activists, educators, researchers, that knowledge is equally important, but who has access to that knowledge is equally important. So understanding the limitations of our audience has been one of the key points for the reason why the climate movement in Nepal, or I would say also in Kathmandu, but also the cases that we have worked on, has taken its pace because of understanding the limitations of our audience, but also making it accessible of that information. So I would be very honest that in activism and in climate conversations that we have, audience, and we always have people who work under this circle, like you and I, all of us, we always have excuses, or we always probably have problems saying that the information is not being understood, or, all of that. But what we realized over the past couple of years of working in this as an activist and as a team is that environmental jargons and informations are only limited to people who know them, and they are knowledge holders. It is very important to understand that if we are to address the climate change issue and the climate emergency that we are in right now, we have to break away from hoarding knowledge. Hoarding knowledge is not going to get us anywhere. And if we are to work for people in the ground, we have to give them accessibility to those information. And we have to ourselves question, does everybody have access to that information? And more to say, the vocabulary of the information. Because if we are to work for the people in the ground, we have to educate, we have to amplify, we have to get creative as much as possible. Because if we are having these conversations only amongst our own groups or only in specific areas, there's a very less time that we are working with. And thus, understanding our audience has been the key. Accessibility to information. The reason why I'm focusing more on this during this entire presentation is, as an activist myself and as representing People's Alliance for Nation Nepal, which is a loose alliance in Nepal, access to the right information has been very important. Also having the compassion of strategy to bring access to that information, having compassion to share that access to the information that you already have has been one of the core hearts of what we do. How is that information being digested? How is the information being debated upon? There are climate change deniers. There are people who do not believe in climate change. So how have those information being debated upon is something that we have to really look upon, and which we have in the past few years. Where are we lacking in understanding our opponents? Meaning to say, where are we lacking? Are we just going to shame and blame that somebody is not understanding, or are you going to have the compassion in our way of working as activists, as educators, as researchers, as organizations that are working for climate change, but also making sure that we do not actually have time, but we need to find the time to also understand how the counterparts of how they do not understand climate change, and having the compassion to educate that is very important. And I've already touched upon hoarding of knowledge and addressing that as a problem, because over the past few years that we have worked, it has been very difficult as activists to get information, to EIA reports, to different climate related reports that are only locked up in organizations or in big researchers or directors, or only accessible to people who have the network, and that, I believe, has played a huge role in actually why, when we say, why doesn't the public understand, but have we ever looked into, have we actually tried to understand why the public hasn't understood this factor? So that has been one of the important parts of our movement. Public participation, engage, participate, question, rest, and repeat is very important for us. The reason why we rest is because for activists and for activism, I think so resting is one of the key sustaining factors. And when we are to talk about sustainable movements, it is also very important to touch upon how rest is important for activists, for people who are working around the clock to make people aware. This is just a view of what we have been organizing: public participation, which includes creativity and a sense of belongingness. In order to have participatory movements, we have to make sure that the sense of belongingness is there. Everybody is a part of it. When climate change is already happening, it is already affecting everybody. But of course, it is already affecting the global South more. But at the same time, it is also important to involve the global South in those global North conversations. But at the same time, when we do local movements, the sense of belongingness for each and every individual needs to be given, because if we are losing out on understanding the public participation, we are losing out on actually understanding what the movement is all about. I hope I'm clear. I hope I'm not rushing, Shubham. Just give me a more sign or something.
Please.
Yeah.
Haushala, please keep going. This is great stuff.
Okay. So public participation, inclusive creativity, and a sense of belongingness. The reason why we've moved in a very different direction, but also a direction that was quite needed in Nepal, because the climate topics were just being presented in a very, I wouldn't say old, but in a very, in a way that the youth couldn't actually relate, youth couldn't connect. But this is an issue that the youth is facing, and the next generation and the coming generation is going to be a part of that problem that they didn't create. But the thing is, in order to connect with the youth, we have to use creativity. In order to feel people's belongingness in the issue, we have to. And thus, this is when we voiced up about Nijgar Airport that was being built by clearing of 8,000 hectares of land. This was one of the things that the youth they were very, very aware about it, but they didn't have access to information. They were scared to voice up because they didn't even know what EIA meant. And they were scared, they were intimidated to ask what an EIA meant. So these are the things when I talk about jargon, is because for the young people, we are rushing them so much. We're just rushing them into like information. But have we actually thought about like taking a step back and making sure that those jargons are being broken down into, and are we giving them time to at least understand those jargons? Because in this movement, once we started breaking down those jargons, once we started giving the youth the accessibility to creativity in order to understand connectivity of climate change and why Nijgard mattered and why these forests, not just Nijgard, but any other forest mattered, the youth, they took the information not just for themselves, but they shared it amongst their families, their friends. And this is how the movement actually grew stronger and better. So this is just a glimpse of artivism. Artivism has been one of the core hearts of the work that not just we, PAN, do, but every other youth organizations have been doing. But one of the reasons why I focus on artivism is because there are a lot of artists who really highly feel for these issues, but are intimidated, of course, to be a part of these movements or to be a part of organizational reports or researches, because the access to it has always been not accessible, and these information cannot just roam around big UN discussions. I'll be very honest, it cannot just roam around big organizations. If the public, if artists, if educators, if musicians, if people who are doing their normal daily lives do not have access to it, then I would say that we actually do not have time. So this is how the artists were involved. And as Shiva mentioned, yes, I'm a part of Fashion Revolution. One of the key manifestos of Fashion Revolution has also been accessibility. And this is the beauty of banner making, that I would say, where when we did voice up about saving our forest, understanding our biodiversities, this is when we involved makers, stitchers, people who act fashion designers who actually felt strongly about climate change, strongly about Nijgard, strongly about forests that were around them, not just forests that were 7 seas across, but found strongly about Southeast Asia, South Asia context. But the thing was how do we get them together? So the way that we've gotten them together is through getting them the information, sharing them facts, and sharing them the correct facts, and helping them also do their research, but giving them the right tools to do so. And thus that has created a momentum of creating banners. And we really feel that the power of banners are very important, especially when the youth are a part of it. And thus stitching, making has been a part of our activism a lot in the past few years, but of course with COVID, we've switched more into webinars now. So yeah, this is just a glimpse of how we've used mixed media, tech spaces, and created alliances. As I said before, PAN is a loose alliance. We are grateful and we are thankful to have alliances like Harin Nepal, Prashif Nepal, Green Commando, Core Nepal, Kalo 101, artists. They're artists, they're activists, groups who are in different spectrums, but we've been able to get them together in order to voice up for something that really, really matters. Organizing things like hackathons, in focusing more on extraordinary 8, which we call the Anautu Art in Nepali, focusing on 8 of these species that are endangered in the context of Nepal, where spiny babbler is, I would say that these species are in an alarming way dropping, and especially with the river dolphin, there are very, very few. I believe we only have like less than 20 river dolphins. But when we share these informations, a lot of people didn't even know that we had river dolphins or the numbers. So we were able to connect an artist, be it from a visual or music background, connect them to whichever species that they solely felt for, and then connect them and then voice that species out in their music sessions, in their artists, in anything. So this is how we were able to get the momentum going. This is also one of the videos where students and activists also gathered around the DFO and actually had a conversation where we heard about, when we talked about Nijgar, this was in 2019, where this was the only time that we were able to confront and ask him, like, what is the district forest officer doing? So this has been one of the key, not just an achievement, but also actually a place that activists, students, people also feel like, yes, there is a place that to be heard. And even for the government part to understand that we are not coming from a vile place. We are not coming from a place that you do not want to hear us. We are coming to understand from you. So let's sit down, let's talk. But the thing is, the space needs to be made. So this was one of the events that we had after a rally. So we usually use the OWLs, which we call ownership, willingness, learning, and space. Like I said, I'm reiterating audience a lot, because if we do not have people on the ground knowing what is happening, or at least if you give them a little bit of information, if they do not feel a belongingness to that information, then that is only short-lived. So belongingness is important, willingness to wisdom, meaning to like willingness to share information as development sector workers, as environmentalists, as scientists, as researchers, willingness to share that information is what we see as wisdom. Learning to unlearn, for example, opponents who do not want to learn, but when there is compassion, when there is wisdom, we have seen people who did not actually want to learn have started to learn and also to unlearn. Space to create, listen, rest, and repeat. I'm just going to reiterate this more and more, because we need space to create. As young people, we need to be heard. Young people need to rest as well and repeat. We cannot work in an unsustainable way of just taking information, and then again, actively doing something about it, yes, but also actively making sure that there's a rest period. Because if we are to talk about sustainability, and if we are ourselves as activists, as researchers, anybody are not taking the rest time, we have to really think about how are we actually sustaining. So in our movements, we've also honored our achievements and also participation. As you know, activists who work on the ground 24/7, lawyers and anybody do get burned out. Burned out is an issue that needs to be discussed a lot in the activist space, because this is something that hardly people talk about. Climate change is real, but when activists and people who work around the clock are burnt out, it is also burning out the movement as well. So we've also really made sure that we've celebrated our little achievements, thanked people, made time to learn, unlearn from the mistakes or the things that we've done, taking a pause, and also thanking everybody who's been a part of it. Because sustaining our culture of how we work in terms of taking a pause is very, very important. And this I would reiterate more and more is usually in the works of activism, or in the works of that we have worked in the issue of Nijgar to fashion revolution, to any of the issues that we've taken up on the ground, we've realized that media is great, but a toxic media hoarding can also be very detrimental to a movement. Making sure that we are always talking about we and not I, and dismantling the idea of I, me, myself did this campaign, but actually reiterating that we did this campaign is very, very important if we are to talk about change, and if we are to see eye to eye with the things that are happening now. So touching upon the future, as alarming everything is, as fearful everything is, we have realized that with only love, with only community, with only hope that we can see further. And if we have love, hope, and community within our movement, that is only that we can actually work together and move more further and better as well. So designing a future hope with community means like we're growing together, making sure that the movement is not just meaningful, but also making sure that everybody plays an important part in it, making sure the movement is inclusive. People on the ground have the voice. People on the ground are represented, are recognized, and making sure that we are growing together has been one of the core things of the activism that PAN and every other alliance that has done over the past couple of years on the ground. The platforms that we've used has been RTI, social media, visual artists, online campaigns, physical outreach, discussing offline and online as well with webinars, especially in the COVID time. So that is it, my presentation for today. If I do have time, but Shubham, yes.
Thank you so much, Aushala. That was great. It's always a pleasure to hear from you. And I think that last slide was a really beautiful note to end your presentation on. It's you centered your presentation a lot on this topic of knowledge hoarding, right? You and I have talked about this the last time we interacted as well, but man, I must say it's something that I struggle with almost on a daily basis too, because in the last 3-4, like I've always been interested in this topic, but in the last 3-4 years, I've become really entrenched in it, and I'm understanding the science and especially the social science of it. And I found myself, using more and more jargon. I found myself like being, a little like I have little topics that are my favorite topics within the general realm of climate justice, and it's something that I have to really consciously stop myself. And I think that's great that you brought that up. In fact, for everyone, if you're in this event, you're obviously interested in this stuff. And I would really encourage that you do that too, because there's no shaming here, like Oshala mentioned. None of us are perfect activists, none of us are perfect researchers. And we really must always kind of stop and really meditate and think about, okay, whatever I'm doing, what is the ultimate cause of this? So again, thank you so much, Oshala. I really appreciate it. I'll come back to you when we do questions.
Thank you, Shubham. Thank you so much.
Okay, so finally we have our third panelist for the day. We have Iqbal Badruddin. Iqbal has been involved in the Pakistani climate activism scene for a long time, for most of his young life. Iqbal is the founder and lead organizer of Fridays for Future Pakistan, the Pakistani chapter of FFF, which is an international movement of students participating in demonstrations to demand action from political leaders to prevent climate change. I'm sure we've all heard of it. If not as Fridays for Future, then we've certainly heard of it as School Strike for Climate, Youth Strike for Climate, Youth for Climate. I'm sure we've also heard of Greta Thunberg, who's really emerged to become the kind of global face of that campaign. The movement places a large focus on the transition from the fossil fuel industry to renewable energy options. But my previous interactions with Iqbal have also shown me that Iqbal is also equally concerned about local problems that he faces in Pakistan or in South Asia. And he often places very strong emphasis on the importance of educating the most vulnerable communities about the climate crisis. Because if we don't know, then we don't know what we're fighting against and what the urgency should be and what the scale should be. So without any further delay, thanks very much, Iqbal, for joining us today. And we're really looking forward to hearing your perspectives on this topic. So please go ahead and take the floor.
Thank you, Sean. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. So starting from this activism thing, yes, it's really important for us to actually educate people and then expect them to come out and talk about their rights. So if they're not educated, they're not aware of their rights, it's very useless for making people come out and protest for something they don't know or something they don't know how it will affect their future. So climate activism should have been started before, I think 1 or 2 decades before, but yeah, it did start, and we have seen a lot of fluctuation in the movement because of COVID. But then I see that COVID-19 came as a disaster, but also there are a lot of lessons that COVID has given us to actually ponder upon. Like the crisis came in, and we have seen that the world never took climate change as a serious crisis, and the leaders would never do anything to actually work seriously on to stop the climate crisis. But they did start working on COVID-19 because they wanted to get back to normal. So this was something quick. So what we saw was that the response of world leaders to end the pandemic was something very different from ending this climate change thing. And here we can see that there is the potential, there is the main, power to work to stop this crisis. But again, this crisis is because it's a ascending to descending crisis, and it takes time. That's why nobody's serious about it. So climate movements are really important for me, and especially a region like South Asia and especially Pakistan, where we never encouraged school kids to actually go for strike and skipping their school on Fridays, but rather we focused on giving them the education, that why it is important. We use this Fridays for Future platform to actually aware the population in Pakistan, not only the school kids but also the parents, because in traditional societies, like in most of the places in Pakistan, um, school also plays a role, but the families also have a very big role in shaping the minds of their kids. So yeah, we took this opportunity to aware the kids, because uh, our education system, I don't know if I am exactly right, but in South Asian countries the education system is not that much prominent to actually educate the kid uh, in a way that he can critically think about what's going on, right? So whatever we teach our kids here, the curriculum we have um, just teaches them to go by the books, to not think out of the book or out of the book. So what we did was we saw that there is no climate education. So even if you used to ask people about climate change, um, I you can go that majority of were never aware of it. And if someone is not aware of it, so in a predominantly Muslim country, people would rather refer it to the will of God. So if they're referring to the will of God, then uh, I think being an activist, you cannot actually change their mindset in a real quick manner, that this is not God, or this is us. So this is the mindset that we have seen in many parts of our country, that people have no knowledge, so they actually use religion to counter as a counter argument. So we started this thing, we saw that the school kids had no idea, so we went to the college kids. See, we saw that majority of them, more than 90% kids, they never had the idea of climate change. And then we saw the university kids. So even the graduates of university were not aware of climate change as such, but they knew that something is happening. They've seen the climate being changed. So what we did was use this movement to actually aware people in Pakistan, and we've been very successful in actually organizing a lot of school kids, college, and university students to get into this activism thing, change their behavior, play their part, and do something and spread awareness wherever they are living. Now, the thing was that for Pakistan, climate change is something very serious. As last year, German Watch report again stated Pakistan as one of the 10th most countries in the list of 10 most vulnerable countries. And Pakistan only emits less than 1% of the total carbon emissions, right? So now the thing is, many countries signed the Paris Agreement, and it was good on papers that everybody signed it because everybody was there, and they were like, we'll do something, but on papers, right? But the countries that are getting more affected because of climate change were ignored, they were left behind. um, and then COVID-19 came in, and unfortunately in 2016, late 16, uh, Donald Trump came in. He shaped a discourse of climate change. He went to the denial thing, and because this American thing was so prominent for the world, was because America was the leader and had to actually support countries and had to take lead in actually supporting countries of getting affected by climate change. So if the leader is backed off, a lot of countries, those who were looking at the United States also backed off. And then I think this Paris Agreement is just now a piece of paper which is just there, and countries are just talking about it. And then we saw COVID-19. So what COVID-19 did was every country give their NDCs, nationally determined contributions. So they will do it, right? It's voluntary. Now COVID-19 came in, and this is acceptable that of course the economies were damaged and they have to recover. Now I think each country who has to, recover from COVID-19 would not be able to fulfill their promises to lower their emissions, or actually even level their emissions, and not to increase, let their emissions increase. Countries who have, uh, promised for deep decarbonization, um, they can't do this deep carbonization again. Like, they have to actually, give a kick to their economy. And if you want to get back to pre-COVID economy scenario, then do you have to actually work on the traditional way of, making energy and using fossil fuel. So because green energy is something that we say that we have to shift, but and developing countries cannot actually go green in a very, fast manner. Even if we can see that the Western countries are not getting into green in a way that they should have done this before, but it's an expensive way of, making energy. And if it's expensive, then we cannot say it's substitute or alternative to work as, lowering the emissions. So I think there's lack of leadership, the lack of political will in the leaders to do something. Here what we can do is, if we aware everyone, because the leaders, the countries, everyone never aware anyone uh, about climate change or global warming. That is why we are at this point here. So if we aware everyone across us and tell them that this is a problem, and tell them that with the local problems they are facing, we can easily link with the local problems. So if everyone's, if started to change their behavior, I think it will just play a very positive part in shaping the climate change discourse, and in shaping the future generation or future community that's coming in, so that they don't have to work on this education thing. So if no, the time is passing really fast, and we are still trying to make people believe that countries like Pakistan, other, which are more into traditional way of thinking, it's really hard for us to actually let people believe about problems that are made that are linked with human beings, not just God. So things are very in a shaky way. And again, the education system here, the education system is very full of flaws. You cannot expect even a 12-year on a high school kid to actually talk about this topic very, in a way that everybody can say that, yeah, this school kid knows about climate change. So we need to make sure that whatever our curriculum is should include environment, climate change, a personal, responsibility, how one behavior can, change everyone in a community or society. And then we talk about region. Um, the bad thing about the South Asian region, I think, is that this India and Pakistan and China. So these three countries are like, um, so India and China is actually one of like the biggest, largest emitters of carbon dioxide. But again, we are just fighting politically, not working on common issues, and then this is all going to affect the people living in this region. And if it's going to affect living in the region, there's no use of having nuclear bombs or having big armies that have nothing to do, just taking a lot of budgets of this country. And the poverty level is already in, high increase in India and Pakistan. And I think because India and Pakistan is, is mostly relying on agriculture, and if we have to feed our, population, and we have to work on the food security, then we have to think about how to actually invest on these things. We are lacking in technology, we are lacking in a lot of things that we should have done before. And then again, I feel that the Afghanistan crisis, uh, whoever is behind it, whoever, but these things are actually diverting the world attention from the main crisis, and we are going into crisis that are predominantly can be seen that being done by human beings. But the main crisis that we are doing is that we are changing our climate. And if we change our climate, and then we should, keep that in mind, that the climate won't spare us for um, to live any more here in this world. So I think the first responsibility comes in is that whatever shape the condition of the earth is, we should not let it get more worse, and we should work to just stay here, even if this COVID thing will stop us in investing a lot in climate crisis. But we should just actually work on awareness. And last but not the least, I think this climate change dialogue is important in countries that have a lot of big population. So we can see that I feel that the half of the world is there in the South Asian region. It's China, India, Pakistan, and we have Bangladesh, we have Nepal. These countries, some countries are landlocked and they don't have other options. But we have a lot of population here living here, and then we have this responsibility that we have to feed them. But if we are feeding them just in the sense of feeding them, then that's not right. We have to make sure that if we are feeding them, then we are making a very sustainable future for the people coming in, for the next generation. And I think here we need a lot of common, diverse, religious, and political will to actually work together, make a common for our, what I suggest is a curriculum, a common curriculum for the region to work for climate change in this area, because this area has similar climate induced problems and different approaches. And as I told you, there are different approaches because there are different people living here from different religions, and they think that every religion has something different, but from the base of it, every religion is actually the same. No religion teaches hatred or whatever. So we should just come to a common ground for this common issue, and try to be inclusive of whatever we have. The curriculum should be pluralistic, accepted by all, and we should make that the whoever denies, we should able to teach them in a peaceful way that denying is not a solution, because I think a lot of people denies because they don't think they have a solution to do it, and they don't think that they can change their lifestyle. So we need to tell them that we can actually work on it. A single person can actually work and change his or her behavior to change the world. And if we do, then we can teach the Western countries, who are actually the one who started climate change in the world. And then of course I see that now every country is making a lot of contribution in emissions, right? So we need to make sure that we need to teach the Western world that they need to do something. Even if I stress up financially, they need to make sure that they invest, they help the countries that are facing climate change, that are the most vulnerable countries to climate change, and they make sure that they invest in education, they invest in projects that help these countries develop systems that are more into adaptation, if not mitigation. And I think this can only be done if countries in South Asian region stand together. We don't have to find different things in us. We need to find common things in us, so that we can really get up to the point and work for the region. And I think without youth, without students, it's not possible, because they are going to lead in the future. And if they are going to lead in the future, we need to make sure they know about the problem, because these leaders who are currently in place, they won't let us get educated about this. Because if we get educated, we are going to their chairs, and if we take the chairs, of course they know that we are going to kick them out, because whatever they did was not sufficient, and it is a criminal negligence. So education is important, and this is now our responsibility, not to rely on our leaders, not to rely on the organizations that say that we are going to do something in the future. It's on us. It's now our responsibility to just go with what is good for us. And the best thing for us is now to get educated, get educate different people, and educate everyone about this crisis. And once it's educated, We just no need to do activism. Everybody would be aware, and everybody would be able to work their part, and then you can see the world change in a positive way. So yeah, so this is what I want to share about this climate activism. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, Iqbal. That was great to hear your perspective on these issues. And it is always interesting to hear how, we're all in the same sort of boat, fighting against the effects of climate change and, fighting to work on this crisis. But it's interesting how these problems manifest themselves in different areas. So yeah, I really enjoyed hearing that. So we do have a few audience questions that we've curated here. They're all really good questions, and they all have the potential to be really long answers. So I'm going to ask our panelists to try and keep it as short as possible, given that we only have about 15 minutes left. So I'll start, since Iqbal, since you just talked about this. I'll start with one question that comes from our attendee, Tenzing Chops. And they ask, Mr. Iqbal, what is the sensitive way to deal with the religious problem? In all South Asian countries, populations think climate problems are due to the will of God. And actually, I think this question can be combined with another question as well that deals with climate deniers. So for any reason, whether it's to be disbelief of the information they hear, or whether it's for faith-based reasons, for any reasons, question to all three of you. What do you think is a right way and a sensitive way to handle perspectives that aren't factual, but they are very, very convinced that their perspective is actually factual? So either one, whoever wants to start can get started on that.
Okay, so I'll just answer this thing, the religious problem, because I've been witnessing this thing here in Pakistan. It's very common. Whoever I think whoever is going through the religious book tend to ignore the secular system of the country, so they tend to ignore the other education system. So I think what we found out that we tried to take things out of the Quranic context, Islamic context, and of course there are written that the main thing about the Holy Prophet used to say that if you are the stewardship, you have this environmental stewardship. You have to make sure that when you leave this world, you have to make sure the next generation is going to get a good environment than you got it before. So, but the thing is that we take the context from the book and we try to tell them. And the other thing that we use it because it's a sensitive way, we don't get into argument with these people, they don't listen. So we take clerics, we ask them, we ask famous personalities to talk about it in different sermons or whatever they do in seminars and stuff, and they talk about it, and they try to tell people this is your responsibility. Now people are getting, I've seen some changes in people's mind. They're getting to know that yeah, this is something bad for our health. So when it's coming on their health, so we are selfish. So when it's coming on their health, they are thinking about it, or else they would not never think about it. So people are now actually trying to take their mind towards, yeah, this is something bad going on, and I think they think that they should not hurt the environment like they used to. Just an example was cutting trees. So they are not doing it right now because they know the importance of trees. Before that, they only knew the importance of money and stuff. Now when they saw that the heat is not going and the money is not helping them bringing cool, now they're saying that we just go for the natural way of supporting. So yeah, this is one way of dealing it.
Okay, if Dr. Jairam or Haushala would like to add anything, once again reminding to let's keep it short as possible so we can get to as many questions as we can.
Yeah, probably I'll just add that I think climate denialism has reduced a lot in recent years, for sure, from my own experience as well. Even in the US, I think climate denialism does not really exist as much it used to. However, there is a lot of doomism which has taken over. So there are a lot of people who feel we are well beyond the point of action. It's too much catastrophe anyway. We can't do much about it. I mean, that's one of the discourses on climate delay that I was talking about. That what can we do as individuals when you have corporates and the so-called nation states which will go on emit emitting greenhouse gases anyway. What can individuals really do? So there's a lot of doomism in that respect, which kind of takes over. And of course, I think in that sense, it's very important to, it's very important to stop using these images of polar bears and other things, because those are too distant images for people. They don't really recognize or identify with polar bears or any of that. You want to show them pictures and you want to show them graphs which show exactly how it impacts their lives. And it cannot be again based on, something like a sudden precipitation event. That again cannot convince them, because they would feel that this is something that, is likely to happen once in 100 years or something like that. What we need to show is that this is a trend. This is not something that is just going to happen one day and then go away the next day. No, this is a trend. There have been incidents like this, and we need to use facts to our own advantage to show to the people how it affects them on a daily basis. And that, I think, will change the mood when it comes to climate action as well.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry, I totally agree with Iqbal and Dr. Jairam. So I don't think so I have to add anything on that. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. All right, so let's move on to another question. So this one comes from one of my colleagues, Mr. Pawan Roy, and he's curious about how we can balance, the ongoing quest for development, or maybe we should put that in quotes, development, versus maintaining biodiversity. And immediately when you think of this question, like the images that hit you are construction, deforestation, but they can also manifest in more climate justice related ways, right? Like, for example, the fashion industry that Haushala is very active in. A lot of times the social inequities that exist in society are reflected in consumer brands, are reflected in the way brands are sold, the way they're advertised. So how do you think we can balance development versus, or I guess a better way to frame it is, what is the way to make development as sustainable as possible? Once again, let's keep it super short. Whoever wants to go can go first.
Can I just say a little bit? I feel like, yeah, like just looking at those terms like differently is, I think so it's also a problem in itself. I mean, that's my personal opinion, development and biodiversity. But like, how can I go together is always I see like that's when designers come in play, that's when designers, urban designers, any sort of designers coming in. And designing to care is, I think so that's the future of, if we are going to look into like what development is going to look like, is everything has to have the ethos of designing to care, be it clothes, be it consumer goods, be it designing a city, design anything. But if it is designing to care of the community, of the people, of nature, I think so that's the way forward. Otherwise, I don't think so. I don't see any other way of moving forward rather than that.
Yeah, I completely agree with Hoshala on that. And I can't really think of this dichotomous relationship between environment and development, because in the end, development is dependent on the same environment that we are talking about. So whatever developmental gains that South Asian countries have made over a period of time, they are being lost because of climate change as well. So then what kind of development are we talking about? And so that dichotomous sort of relationship is something that we need to rethink about as citizens movements, and something that also needs to be built into our own understanding of the environments that we live in. So I think something that would help us understand these relationships between biodiversity, environment, development, built environment, urban centers, whatever, all these things. I think one of the systems of knowledge we have completely neglected is the indigenous knowledge, in which there's never been that kind of difference between humans and environment. Humans have always been part of the environment. And this is something where I think we need to sort of cut off our understanding of environment and development from the Western notions, and kind of build our own understanding through these indigenous cultures which have survived and thrived for ages. And now we are trying to displace them with colonial knowledge, which is not going to help countries like South Asia in the long run.
Okay, that's very well said. Totally agreed with both those perspectives. Iqbal, did you want to add something, or should we move on to final question?
No, you should move on.
Okay, so we have many different questions here from many different people who that kind of are around this idea of empowering activists. So I'd like to quickly take a few names here. So Eva Torres, Bibhuti Pathak, and Mr. Nupani, Mr. Sharad Nupani, all ask about the sort of efficiency of activism in general. Mr. Nupani's question is more to do with this idea that, since climate change is a human-caused problem, there doesn't seem to be enough of a change of thought among humans. Like, we're still very capitalistic in the more subconscious ways that we handle things. And along the same lines, the other questions were about how we can empower activists, because a lot of the times, people who come from these vulnerable communities are by definition not very resource wealthy. So it's not only a problem of information, which we talked about, but they also don't have, say, the finances or the platforms or the infrastructure to even bring these questions up and to basically to fight for their cause in a way that can be scalable. I think it's an important and it's a difficult balance to really try and empower vulnerable communities without taking up their space. It's again one of those things that I personally have struggled with myself, and I'd love to hear all three of your perspectives on that. So let's say this is the final question, and then each of you can have a few minutes to answer that, and then we'll wrap things up. I think let's go with the order that we delivered the presentation. So maybe Dr. Jairam, and then Hoshala, and then Iqbal.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, as I mentioned, even in my presentation, obviously, there are going to be section of the population which is always going to be more affected by climate change than the others, and we have seen that whether it is the international level where the island countries or the least developed countries are being affected more. And that's why the voices from these countries are much stronger as compared to some other countries. Similarly, within South Asian countries also, you would find that not just in terms of physical vulnerability, right? So there are some parts which are, again, coastal areas or river delta areas or mountainous areas where you have higher amount of vulnerability. Now, these are the voices which need to be amplified even more, because I think that will bring more sort of impetus, or it will give more impetus to not just state-led action, but also other citizens groups and other civil society organizations to take up these issues on a much grander scale. And right now, because I also work on climate diplomacy, what I can see is that non-state actors, non-governmental organizations have taken a much bigger role in climate action. So today, all these ground level sort of action is much more stronger as compared to what the states are doing. And that may actually lead to the understanding of these vulnerable populations much more, and also in terms of knowledge creation around solutions, and whether it is very importantly, adaptation. I think as we are talking about reducing greenhouse gas emissions as well, there are a lot of countries which do not emit as much as all these countries. So we also need to think about how are we going to raise finances for adaptation for these countries. And in all these respects, I think this year is going to be very crucial. Although yes, in that sense, I'm also a little skeptical of what is going to come out of the COP. But hopefully, there's going to be a groundswell of various movements from across the world that will take the momentum forward, and we don't really have to depend on the UN Convention alone to give us solutions to climate change.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Dr. Jairam, and also like putting in perspective of like what we had shared earlier, like the participation of local communities, the participation of people, like the sense of belongingness and sense of ownership to climate change, to climate justice is very important for communities that are coming from marginalized backgrounds, And because the thing is, when you involve communities from the heart itself, you get an idea. Like, for example, we've got an amazing like shared idea of like involving mothers group from those areas, from local VDCs, involving the youth groups in the VDCs, and then educating them, giving them the tools to educate. It's not like we need to stop like taking everything ourselves and say like, oh, I'm going to go and save, that the savior thing needs to really change our mind. It's decolonization as well of how we've actually, been educated and seen the developed ways of working. And actually South Asia has, that's how we've been. But now it's time to change that. And I feel like that's the reason why like the sense of ownership and sense of belongingness, when you have those conversations with people on the ground, you get solutions of how those information can be actually rooted down more, and where solutions actually can come collectively, then in a way of a savior sort of a way, and that's when I say like involving mothers group, involving youth, involving children's clubs that are in those areas, which that area itself they know about, is how to get everybody involved and to work more on those climate actions as well.
Iqbal,
Yeah.
would you like to add to that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add. So this climate justice is important. So overcome climate justice, like if we are not actually involving those people who are the one who are vulnerable, who are from the marginalized communities. So I think we are not doing justice, right? So if one person, for example, it's just in my mind, if a graduate of Harvard University comes in, do this thing and that thing, so he knows about the problem, but I think he might not have the actual experience climate change by himself, right? So if a person living in areas where it's a mountainous area, he faces climate change, or he faces a lot of problem because of it, I think we should involve that person into that thought making process or policy making process, or sense of inclusiveness, that you are here, you know the things, you faced it, you are the primary source, and then we can go out. So if he feels inclusive, he feels that he's being given a chance to be heard, so in that sense, that community, that people would be more into working on it. And I think without educating or aware people, the best way of getting things done is that we actually make them feel they are the part of it. And this is the difference between us and the Western society. So if we say that the majority of the people in Western societies are more aware of it, they have their way of life in a more sustainable way, trying to do it, it's just because they know about that issue, right? If you know about the issue, you're going to do something about it. So I think one point is that, and the second point is that we cannot fight a crisis if we don't know about the crisis. So education is the linchpin of any activism or any movement.
Okay, thanks to all three. Those are all great perspectives. So, given that we're talking about climate justice today, I did mention the last question was our final question, but we just got a really good, relevant, pertinent question here from Mr. Zahid Khan Akhtar from Afghanistan. And he asked, how will we struggle towards environmentalism when there is a ban to speak even for basic human rights? And every natural and man-made hazards are considered to be divine, or we mentioned earlier the will of God problem, and question considered to be a sin from the government officials themselves. So in a nutshell, what he's really asking is, climate change isn't a problem that exists in itself, right? It exists in the world, and the world already has its many other problems as well. So I think for a final question, if we could just take a second to share your thoughts on how we can make the climate justice movement in South Asia as inclusive of all other movements, make sure that human rights abuses are also handled, make sure that social inequities are also addressed. And I think maybe this time we can go the other way around. So we'll start with Iqbal and then Haushala and then Dr. Jairam.
I actually totally agree with him. And I think we here I feel him that Afghanistan, because of the current nature of the government, I don't think they would ever believe in climate change. Uh, but similarly, our government believe in climate change, but the people living in Pakistan are not like believing in climate change. so it's like somewhere there around you find many loopholes in the society that pave way to go to climate deniers. So I think this thing for especially for Afghanistan, it's now the responsibility, international organizations and other countries' responsibility, especially the UN, to make sure that Afghanistan and the government of Afghanistan believes in climate change and work on it. So and they can do it. They can do it if they don't have any other interest in Afghanistan. They can definitely going to make sure they do something. Taliban government can do something about it because it's a human issue. And of course, we can't say that if Afghanistan is not believing it, if Afghanistan is not going sustainable, it won't affect any other country. It's going to affect other countries too, its neighbors and the region. So I think this God will is it there, it is there in the holy book, right? But the thing is that they manipulate, they interpret the book in such a way that a majority of the people believes in it. And this is the irony, especially for the Muslims in the world, that they don't actually go by the book. They just go by the false interpretation of the book, and they find it so easy to go, so they just go for it. So whenever you see something hard, that is the right way of doing, and we skip it. So this is the environmental sustainability can be ensured by the international government and by, of course, individual. So I think in Afghanistan, especially, it's now the responsibility of international government to make sure they believe in it. If they don't believe it, they have a lot of options to make them do this thing. So yeah.
Yeah, what Iqbal said, like I'll also add on, like this is the thing about like education, like, and how developed notions come into being. Like we need to look at sustainability and sustaining. Sustainability is a noun. Sustaining is a verb. Let's start changing our lenses. Start seeing it sustaining, like if we are to talk about environmentalism, if you are to environmental, but these words are big. Sustainability might be easier for people like you and I who are constantly like we are dealing with. But if we look at it as a noun and as a sustaining verb, as a verb, there are cultures, there are indigenous practices. I come from an indigenous ethnic background. We have sustaining practices that we've been sustaining. And many communities in Nepal and South Asia have sustaining practices. How do we amplify those? Don't just talk about sustainability, because that's only about like noun. We are really like, we have to be really careful of how these words are coined and for what purposes are they coined. Are they only coined to make a sustainable urban city? And then it's going to marginalize actually communities that are already marginalized, and we expect those communities to speak for sustainable cities? No, they're already dealing with a lot. So sustaining is what I always try to focus on, and I always encourage people to like talk about sustaining practices than sustainability is what I look into as. And that's my last final. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just keep it very brief. I think I completely agree with both Iqbal and Hoshala on this. And just to add, like Hoshala mentioned, we cannot really put the onus on the most marginalized peoples to just take care of themselves and build resilience and take action on climate. Everything cannot be put on the most marginalized communities, which are further being marginalized by climate change and its effects. I think that's very important. And the situation today in Afghanistan, for instance, also brings to the fore the importance of climate change. This is one country which is very, very vulnerable to climate change. There are a lot of studies which indicate how, even in the past 20 years, water scarcity issues or drought-related concerns have been amplified because of climate change. So, climate change could be one ways of bringing the communities together in a country like Afghanistan, where the society itself has ruptured a lot with continuous war, and now, what is going on today. And anyway, things are in flux in the country as of now. So this could be the way to bring communities together to fight for their own survival and also fight for their human rights, because in the end, this is an issue which is going to affect their human rights, their right to life, right to water, right to food, right to everything is going to be affected by climate change. So I think it's important to bring out these voices and also like Iqbal mentioned, like international organizations have to play the role in that respect to pressurize the so-called stakeholders in Afghanistan to do something about it.
Okay, thanks so much. I can talk about this topic for hours and hours, and I have with many of you, but unfortunately, we're really, really short on time now. So I'd just like to say thank you so much to everyone who attended, to all three of our panelists. We will be sending everyone a survey form via email after the webinar ends. So I'd like to ask everybody to please fill that up, because that's going to be really big help for us. Besides that, I'd just like to once again encourage everyone to check out Center for Social Change, socialchange.org.np. We actually have two ongoing blog series where we're accepting outside contributions. One is called the Governance blog, and one is called the People Power blog. So please look those up. I see someone from my team has just shared all the relevant social handles and all the URLs. So please feel free to check us out more. I know that we got a few questions at the end that I wasn't able to address. So sticking with the information to accessibility theme, I'd like to encourage you all to please send your questions to me via email, and I'll make sure they'll get to all our speakers today. Once again, Dr. Jairam, Haushala, Iqbal, it's always a pleasure to talk to all three of you, and today has been no different. Really appreciate you making the time. And thank you again to everyone who joined us. And we hope you're going to keep joining us for other future events like today's. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.